Welcome to our Strategic Partner Series. This series comes out once a month, and within these conversations with coaches and consultants, EOS implementers, predictive index partners, and the like, what you will hear is how these folks walk beside and really support CEOs to implement really strong people strategies inside their organizations. Join me in welcoming our guest for this week. We have two amazing guests this week with Phoenix Perform, and I am so excited to introduce you to Tom and Brad. Tom and Brad have come together to really serve CEOs, specifically in education, in creating transformative cultures. And with that, you will hear from them how they go about doing that and how their background uniquely provided them that experience. Tom and Brad, it is great to chat with you again. And the two of you are partnering with predominantly school districts and really chatting with their leadership team about culture within the organizations. And I'm curious, what in your life and career led you to care so deeply about organizational culture?
I had an experience over 30 years ago now with one of these, weekend-long personal development workshops that had some follow-up work and led me to do a lot of other programs with that organization. And it was really transformational. I mean, it really gave me an opportunity to see myself in a whole different way. I quit smoking. I quit drinking. I made major changes in my life that I'd wanted to make for a long time. And I said at the time, I got my hands on the controls, It's like whatever was driving me, I got control of. And so I got into the coaching business because I got trained in being a coach there and started working with people individually and realized that when you work with people individually, it's really hard for people to sustain that kind of personal growth, that kind of personal development on their own without a strong support system around them. So it became apparent that we needed to do this work within teams of people and help them to be more effective at supporting one another and growing and supporting one another and being more effective, which years later got characterized. This was in 92 when I started. Years later got characterized as corporate culture. There wasn't even talked about it that way in those days. So it really came out of an outgrowth of I want to help people to grow into and develop into the best form of themselves. And the best way to do that is to create cultures that foster that kind of growth, which, by the way, makes the organizations much more effective.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And how about you, Tom?
Well, I was a school superintendent, and so I've always loved human beings, and I always loved kids in particular. And, there's a great quote that if you want to change the world, the most powerful force there is to do so is through education. And so in a way, what we're really doing is helping to educate adults and leaders on how to better interact together, using the wisdom of the last couple thousand years, along with the latest in brain science. And so it's this fascinating, very complex work that's very artistic, but it's also tremendously rewarding because we know that, Brad's been doing it for over 30 years now. I've been doing it for close to 10 years. And a client after client will talk about how this has made them a better parent or a better leader or a better sister, or colleague, and that it's profoundly changed their life. And so we kind of pinch ourselves that we get paid to do this work.
Amazing. I went to a leadership development program. Oh man, it was once a quarter in Atlanta for 3 years, along with the weekly, and one of the things that my coach would always say is it's the same pot of soup. When you learn leadership, you apply it to every domain of your life. And I think that's what I just heard you say, Tom.
Yes, exactly. I always tell the adults, the adult leaders, CEOs, school superintendents that, look, you would never treat a third grader the way that you treat each other. And we're all just grown children. So start thinking about your colleagues as that third grade kid that you care deeply about at school.
And you just said something really interesting about, essentially it's artistic. So how is coaching artistic?
You know, coaching is something that happens in a conversation between two people. You know, it's one of the challenges in writing the book, frankly, was there was no one to interact with. So we couldn't create together like we do with a client, you know, this discussion that makes a difference for people. So back to coaching, that the ability to listen and to listen for, you know, what are the underlying assumptions behind people's beliefs? How do we help them uncover those things? All that. It's very much an art form. I can never tell you how I'm going to get to what I need to get to with a client beforehand. It just happens. And I don't mean it happens like it has a life of its own or it's magic. It's just a matter of learning the tools and then applying them in hundreds of different ways, you know, as opposed to following this, stay on these rules, follow this policy or this practice, and you'll get it. Nah, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. I mean, we are human, right? So we don't always follow what's been prescribed in front of us.
Yeah, exactly. And I like to say that, you know, foundationally, it's listening the greatness out of your people. That if you really want to simplify coaching, that's it. Most of what happens in really effective, deep level coaching is that you're listening to them and you're asking open-ended questions. You're asking layering questions. You're asking good questions to get them thinking out loud because the answer is inside them. The answer is always there. They just need help unpacking it and they need help getting beyond their own self-limiting beliefs. And that I say they, but we human beings all need that help.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious, what had the two of you join together to serve school districts?
Well, it gets back to, for each of us, different stories, but I come from a long line of educators, and so I think that's always been part of it. I'll never forget my grandma. I would go over there for tutoring, and after I did all the things I had to do, she would bake these little cherry tarts that were these amazing desserts that I got to eat, and whether I learned anything or not didn't really matter. I got the tart, and so I think it instilled in me at a pretty young age this desire for learning and getting better. And then more personally, I could tell you hundreds of stories from my time of working in schools in Detroit, and that, if we should treat anybody well, it should be kids. And yet kids come from some pretty rough backgrounds, so to me, I've always been driven at how do we help those who need the most help and who have had a pretty rough upbringing, and kids are ultimately deserve better.
And for me, it was a conversation I had with a good friend who's a psychologist who talked about the courts asked him to conduct a court-ordered group session with male perpetrators of domestic violence. And he refused. He said, no, I don't want to have anything to do with them because they're a rough crowd. They're not looking for help. They're court-ordered. They're not there of their own, choosing. And they're not real well educated. They don't have the agility, the conceptual agility to be able to, create new concepts and then try to live them out. But finally, they kept after him. Finally, he said yes. And he looked at me and he said, and that's my favorite night of the week now. And I said, what do you mean it's your favorite night of the week? How can that be? You just described how difficult it is. He said, well, I teach them how their brains work and how to regulate their emotions, basically. And he said, and every one of them in their own way and in their own words in the first 90 days or so says to me, if only I'd known this as a kid, the trajectory of my whole life would have been different. And he said, and usually they're in tears when they say that, or tears welling up. And I got teary-eyed. And I don't know what it was. I just looked at him and I said, we got to figure out a way to get this in the schools. And, just then, coincidentally, social emotional learning was coming out. This is a little more than 10, 12 years ago now. Social emotional learning was coming out, and I ran across an article about that and got a book about it. As I'm reading that, a guy who's a friend of mine who happens to be a former superintendent of schools contacts me and says he's retiring. I said, good, you want to help me get into this market because I don't know anybody in that market? He said, sure. So we start chipping away And then a mutual friend of Tom and mine, sends us both a note and says, hey, you guys should meet each other. I think you have a lot in common. And we met each other and realized we were both committed to helping schools build cultures that are rooted in the adults being able to be socially and emotionally adept so that they could be that lesson for the kids. And the rest is history.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that story of why these are so important to you and the impacts of that. And as you look at, creating exceptional cultures inside of schools and partnering with those leaders, what impact does the individual's passion and background have on those cultures being exceptional?
Tapping into people's passion, even more than their background, is what makes great organizations. If you look at a great sports team is a team of people who are really excited about the game, who really love the game, who are out there for the purpose of just excelling the game at the game. And organizational work is no different, business, etc. It's people who have an impassioned sense of purpose, that they have a sense that they're making a difference, and they come home at night tired, but feeling like what I did today mattered. That's the foundation, more than the foundation, that's the fuel that energizes great organizations. And cultivating that is the foundation of a great culture and a great leader.
And this, I think, leads us right into the two of you wrote a book. And as you talked about, the book was in a vacuum versus with clients, but I know you took your client stories with you when you wrote the book. So the great engagement with resignation, kind of crossed out within that. So you talk about leadership through a virtuous cycle. And I think you just hit a little bit on this, Brad. But what is the virtuous cycle of leadership and how does that really impact?
Yeah, so great question. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who many of your listeners may be familiar with, she wrote on death and dying and is famous for the 5 stages of grief. She was a brilliant woman. And she made a case that foundationally under all other emotions are really 2 emotions. And they're at the opposite ends of the spectrum at the very root. And so one of those is fear, not surprisingly. And at the other end is love. And more specifically, this unconditional love that she talked about, this agape love of putting the other first, of being of service to others. And in really simplistic terms, that's what it is. That if you've got a culture of people operating out of fear, you likely have a vicious cycle going and you don't even realize it, but you're stuck in this vicious cycle. And if you've got a culture that's all about serving others and providing benefit and being of service to the world and to the clients or the patients or the students, and everybody, not perfectly, but everybody is marching in that direction in a consistent way, then you've got a virtuous cycle. You've got a cycle that's going to self-reinforce in good ways because we're all marching to the same beat of the drum. And so in really simplistic terms, that's what the distinction is between the virtuous cycle and the vicious cycle.
And unless your listeners listen, as I would have when I was first exposed to these ideas, lest they listen to this like, well, we don't have a culture of fear. This doesn't pertain to me. Human beings are motivated by fear. We just are. We avoid things. The news at night appeals to our fears, and we keep watching it because we want to be on guard. We are driven by fear. It's very common for people to talk about, well, I'm not comfortable with that, or that's outside my comfort zone. Well, it's a nice way of saying, I'm afraid to take that risk. I don't want to behave in that way. I'm not okay with that. It's a low level fear, but it's fear nonetheless. And when we stay within our comfort zone, we are reinforcing our own self-limiting beliefs that we can't do this or that. And it stifles creativity. It stifles risk-taking. It stifles our ability to really be able to join together and take the risk to, trust one another and go forward. It stifles all of the great, the list of great behaviors that any organizational development specialist would say, here are the attributes of a great organization. So human nature is to operate out of fear, and to generate a culture that operates out of this desire to contribute to others is something that needs to be done very consciously and very intentionally, because it doesn't come to us naturally.
Yeah, let's make it a little more tangible, okay? Because we're talking a little bit of theory, which you need. You need the foundational theory, but then let's translate this into some real world examples. So we have these 12 cultural mindsets that we lay out in our book, The Great Engagement. And one of them is avoidance, that especially in education industry and the human services industries, that we have really nice people who are committed to being of service to others, right? The flip side is that we tend to, myself included, we tend to avoid the tough stuff. We tend to avoid conversations that we know we need to have. We tend to avoid dealing with an employee who may not be sort of up to snuff because we're afraid of losing them, or we're afraid of being singled out or being called a micromanager, of lots of reasons. But fundamentally, we're just avoiding things. So when we avoid, what do? Well, we'll go talk to others about it instead of going to that person. Well, what's that called? Typically, that's gossip. And if you get enough gossip going, then you create some drama, and people start to make up reasons for things, and they start to confabulate stories. And then you've got people starting to assume nefarious intent about each other. And so you can see how one of these cultural mindsets of avoidance can lead to gossip, can lead to drama, can lead to assuming nefarious intent. And all of a sudden, you've got this vicious cycle going. And likely someone in your audience, people in your audience, right now, think about, what are you avoiding at the workplace? You're a leader of people. What do you know you need to deal with that you've been avoiding? And I'll put myself as an example. For probably a good part of a year, I was avoiding dealing with an employee who just wasn't getting the job done. An amazing human being, a great person, but wasn't getting the job done. And thankfully, one of my team members came to me and said, "Hey, Tom, are you going to do something about that?" And he woke me up to the fact that I was avoiding this, and I had been for a long time. So for all of us, this is not a bad thing. This doesn't make any of us bad. It just means that we're unconsciously not being awake to things like avoidance or drama or gossip.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And that avoidance piece, I think we all have that. We just talked about that this morning, and, the leadership program that I run as well is, what are we avoiding within it? And, when we hear those complaints, they're actually poorly worded requests. How do we look at it that way, right? And so as we shift a little bit, we have the privilege of chatting with Dr. Tom Mahoney next week, and you'll hear from him on the show. And I know that you partnered with Tom and the Oregon School District. Could you share a little bit about how you really approach supporting executives in districts in implementing some of these ideas, whether it is kind of those 12 steps, that virtuous cycle, the conscious leadership coaching within that leadership team?
Well, a really simplistic answer is we get people talking to each other. It's not about us sharing our infinite wisdom, because that would take about 3 minutes. It's really about orchestrating a discussion between them in two different domains. And we get together, we launch a bunch of surveys and stuff, and we use the surveys to get them talking about like the current state of their culture. Where is it working? Where is it not working? But it's not a theoretical discussion about culture. It's just about what's people's experience around here, and what would they say are your strengths as an organization? What would they say are your weaknesses? And this always leads them to having discussions that they've never had before. They stop avoiding a lot of the big issues, frankly, because we keep drilling in and questioning and pushing and prodding. And through that, not only do they stop avoiding and have the conversations they need to, but they learn that they can do it with each other. So they have the experience. So when they walk out, then they could do it without us in the room. Likewise, we have put them through a coaching exercise. We have them coach each other. And they all walk in with lots of trepidation, and they walk out knowing, oh, we can do that. That's great. Everybody sees my weaknesses. I don't have to hide them anymore. And not only do they accept me with those weaknesses, but my team is here to support me in that, to help me. And we do a lot of work with them and helping them to develop their conscious purpose, that they get passionate about. And I say conscious because it's there. They just haven't put it in words. They just haven't, we do that so that they can share with others. So those are the examples, but it's a series of discussions that we orchestrate among them that are designed to reestablish the norms of what we talk about, of how we lead, of how we manage, of how we coach one another, not by talking about the theory, but by having them practice these things together. And then we debrief with them and have them see oh, yeah, that's what I just experienced.
As was stated early in the conversation, coaching is creating the space for the individuals to see that they actually have the answers in themselves.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Mahoney will tell you this, but they saw significant improvements in their academic results. They had over 100% increase in their English and language arts scores. They had a 70% increase in their math scores, even though we weren't really focused on that. That was not our primary aim of the work, but it's a result of doing the deeper work. And that's really instructive for leaders out there, that if you're trying to fix something, if you're trying to make something better, oftentimes going at it directly is not the solution. You've got to go to the root cause. You got to get down to the roots. If you have a problem with a tree and you start cleaning each leaf, that's not going to get you very far, right? You've got to go to the roots and figure out, what does this tree need at the root level that will then produce the leaves and produce the fruit. And so the same is true for us as leaders, is that too often we bring in these consultants or we hire somebody to do a survey, and really all we're doing is addressing the symptoms. We're addressing the leaves. And the harder work, no doubt the harder work, is to slow down and think about, okay, what's gonna result in a bigger impact? Well, we got to slow down. We got to have more meaningful, more challenging conversation, because as coaches, one of the things that we like to say and remind clients of is that we're not committed to your comfort. We're committed to your growth.
And growth is uncomfortable.
Yeah, by definition, if we live in a comfort zone, then what's outside that comfort zone is the learning zone or the growth zone.
Right.
So we have to get uncomfortable most of the time if we really want to have more meaningful growth.
Absolutely. And kind of going back to one of the very first parts of our conversation is that, leadership in this growth is incredibly personal. What happens at home and what those things are has a direct impact on what's specifically happening in the workplace, because it's that deep personal work. And I think we'll definitely hear that from Dr. Mahoney next week as well. And so based on our conversation today, what's a last thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
It starts with you. That, culture shaping, if you want to create an exceptional culture, it's 100% doable. It's not something that's impossible for your company. I don't care what your circumstances are, how much money you have. It is 100% possible. So it starts with you as the leader, or maybe you're not the CEO. It can still start with you if you muster the courage to say, we need to tackle this thing. We need to go to work on improving our culture. And oftentimes that starts with yourself and really getting clear about, what do we need to do and where do we need to get better? Whether it's hiring someone like us or it's reading our book and trying to tackle it yourself. But it starts with a commitment to making things better, because shaping a culture is a we thing. It's not a they thing. We don't get to blame society or the boss or the boss's boss. At the end of the day, every single person within an organization has a responsibility to make the culture better, because you're either improving it or you're detracting from it. There is no neutral.
And, we think of organizations, if we want to grow our organization, we want to grow our organization's ability to satisfy customers or grow sales volume or, grow in any dimension. the only way you grow an organization is by growing the people that comprise the organization. You have to increase people's capacity to produce whatever it is that you're looking to produce. So as a leader, most of us that are in leadership positions got here because we were really good at doing things, at getting stuff done. And because we were so good at producing results, we got promoted. But at some point, when we get promoted to a leadership position, our job completely changes, except usually nobody tells us that. So most of us, myself included, early in my career, approach our jobs like it's about being a super doer. So I end up working 12 hours a day in order to get all the work done. But the secret is that that's not your job anymore. Your job is to grow your people. If we're going to grow our organization, you got to grow your people, and that's your primary job. And that's a completely different mindset. I gotta make sure my sales force is driving sales so I could run out and make sales calls with all my salespeople because I know that I'm a great salesperson. I can help them close deals. But that doesn't help them grow. It doesn't create capacity. So the better question is, how do I help grow my salespeople so that they're much more effective? And if I do that, then it's going to show up in increased sales. It's a different mindset. Now, I may still go out with my salespeople and make sales calls, but now I'm looking at how do I empower this person? How do I support them in being more effective rather than circumventing them and closing the deal myself as a super doer?
So if you want to create a more engaged culture, start with that premise of how do I grow my people? And it starts with you, by the way. It starts with how do I grow myself? And so one of the things we'll do, Traci, is we'll put together a landing page for this that people can go and check out. And we'll make sure that we include what we call the Engaged Life Inventory. So we'll put that out there for free for folks. It's just a 2-page PDF you can print out, and it'll help you to really get clear about where are you engaged in your life and where are you not engaged. And it's a great starting point to the journey. So if you go to phoenixperform.com/the-people-strategy, so phoenixperform.com/the-people-strategy, we'll make sure that resource is up there for your listeners.
That was an incredible conversation with Brad and Tom. My 3 key takeaways from this week were the distinction between fear and love and how coaching creates specific emotions and behaviors. The second one was on avoidance as a cultural mindset. And then the third is really looking at the current state of culture. So that first insight is fear and love. We specifically look at unconditional and agape love as being of service to others, or we look at the fear of what we are not specifically doing or the fear of getting in trouble for something. And I don't know about you, but I know for me that when I truly am passionate and love what I do, I'm driven by that. And when we can cultivate that love for each other, that agape, that unconditional love for our team, we know that they have our back and we also have theirs. And so when we look at this distinction between fear and love, the people strategy around that is how do we create the environment where our team truly feels that they have each other's back, that unconditional love, so to say, of each other is truly within that environment, that we're not fearing the repercussions of doing something wrong, but we are really stepping up and into our highest level because we truly have each other's back and we are passionate about what we are doing. And what we notice is that, the outcomes of that are, as we're going to hear next week when we talk to Dr. Mahoney from Oregon School District, is that it resulted very specifically in a 308% increase in test scores. So how we have each other's back as a team has very significant impacts within the organization. The second insight is avoidance. So my question here is, as an insight, is how many things are we specifically avoiding in our day-to-day work? And when we allow the avoidance to happen, and when we allow the avoidance to happen for ourselves and for our team, it creates an environment where the things aren't getting done and move to that next level. So the action here is, just ask yourself, what am I avoiding? And why? Why am I avoiding that? When we can start to hold each other accountable for those avoidances and really talk about what's behind it. What is behind it? It is an and both of the culture and the environment that we are creating. Again, those business outcomes, when we stop avoiding the things that we're fearful of and start addressing it and building trust through conversations, we can elevate those specific results. The third insight is really looking at the current state of our culture. So kind of goes along with avoidance, but it is, what are the strengths and weaknesses of our culture? And the strategy here is, how do we create the environment to have the conversations that we've never had before? It was such a key insight because, as we heard Tom and Brad talk this week, and as we will hear Dr. Mahoney talk next week, it is those conversations that built the trust that were allowed them to get that last 10% of the way done to get the business impacts. And in this case, increase the test scores within the organization. So with that, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the People Strategy Podcast, and join us next week where we hear about the impacts of the work with Phoenix Perform within the Oregon, Illinois School District. Thank you so much for listening today. I'd love to connect with you. If you'd like to connect, you can find me on LinkedIn at Traci, Traci Austin, and at our website at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. If you'd love to learn more about our process, please reach out to us. And again, thank you so much for listening and sharing your feedback with us through a review. Have a fantastic day.